Please take your Bibles with me this morning and turn in them to Exodus chapter 20. If you're using one of the Pew Bibles, that's on page 61. And would you please stand with me this morning as we read? As you're turning there, on the way up to the pulpit here this morning, my little brother Johnny said, "Dude, you better do good. Alex was rocking it the last 2 weeks." So with that said, I strongly encourage you, if you weren't here for Pastor Alex's messages, to please check them out on Facebook Live. I listened to last week's. The week before, we were up at Becky's church in New York, and I intend to listen to the first one. I was talking about the second one to someone, and they said, "Man, you got to check out the first one too." So they really were drawn to the first one. So please look those up on Facebook Live and check those out. For this morning's reading, we will be reading from chapter 20, verses 1 and 2 from Exodus. And God spoke all these words, saying, "I am the Lord your God, who brought you out of the land of Egypt, out of the house of slavery." May the Lord add his blessing this morning to the reading of his word. You may be seated. If you haven't noticed, we've gotten to Exodus chapter 19, and the pace has slowed a little bit. And as far as the sermon and the passages, and we've been kind of pacing ourselves a little bit more purposefully when we've gotten to Exodus chapter 19. Because at Exodus 19 and in Exodus 20, God is giving to his people his law. And I want to tell you with that why we should slow down and pace ourselves as we enter into the portion of God's law. In order to illustrate that this morning, I brought with us, Alex shared that we're heading out on a wilderness trip this Friday. This is our book, this is our guide for the river that we're doing in the Lower Salmon River in Idaho. It's called Guide to the Snake River in Hell's Canyon. That's kind of another omen why we should have probably avoided this trip. And the Lower Salmon River. And what this guide does is it gives you a map of the river. And as it gives you a map, it also gives guidance as to these different portions and junctures in the river. And I want to read one in particular. This is kind of a picture of the map, and then this is the commentary on the river, and this is at mile 23.3 called Snow Hole Rapid. And I want you to listen to what it says about Snow Hole Rapid. Snow Hole Rapid should be scouted on the left by landing in the large eddy just upstream. The left side of the river is congested with huge boulders, and there are more snaggletooth boulders and a pour-over on the far right side. The best route is to follow the turbulent tongue by entering right of center. Enter it correctly, and the rapid is easy. Enter it poorly, and your day may go badly. And we can't afford guides. Somebody asked if we have a guide. No, well, it would make it exponentially more expensive, but we think we got it covered, okay? Moving on. The reason I read that to you is for the particular spot that says this rapids should be scouted before it's run. And the idea is you pull your raft over, you pull your kayaks over, you get out, you park them, and you just kind of observe the river and say, okay, their route says this, we're looking at this, and that's where you want to enter, and that's how you do it. So, but it's a scout. It requires a scouting before it's run. Not all the rapids are like that. This particular is the roughest one on the trip, I think, and so they really encourage it to be observed. Take a step back, look at it before you enter into it. And that's essentially why we've slowed down as we've come to the Ten Commandments. what the Bible refers to as the 10 words. It doesn't call them commandments. It says the 10 words, and quotes with it. If you get law wrong. So we have to get this right. We got to understand the intent, the purpose, the context of God's law. And so the reason we've read just 2 verses before we get into the 10 commandments, the 10 words, is because here God reiterates something that he already said in Exodus 19. 19:4 to be exact. Before he gets into law, he says, "You yourselves have seen what I did to the Egyptians and how I bore you on eagle's wings and brought you to myself. Now therefore, if you obey." But he's going over their redemption with them. He's reminding them that he is a redeeming God. Out of the worst imaginable circumstances, he redeems, he saves. And he says the same thing nearly in Exodus 21:2. He says it again. And God spoke all these words saying, "I am the Lord your God who brought you out of the land of Egypt, out of the house of slavery." In other words, that redeeming act needs to be constantly paraded in front of your minds for you to properly receive my law. In fact, that phrase, in Exodus 21:2, just take a guess how many times that phrase is repeated in the Old Testament. Try 125 times he says that. "I am the Lord your God, the one who redeemed you out of Egypt." 125 times he says that, which is essentially the Old Testament version of the gospel message. That's why Pastor Alex's messages are so important as we consider the law. That grace comes before grace in the law. You see, if some person that you've never met before comes up to you and says, "Hey, I'd like you to take off your clothes until you're bare naked," you're going to wince. You're going to recoil. You're going to step back. You're going to look for some protection. It's a very uncomfortable thing to have said to you by a person you've never met before. But what if I told you that there was a moment in life where you would hear those words from a complete and total stranger and you'd be like, "Absolutely, can you help me do it?" Well, if you were rescued out of hypothermic water from a diver who just risked his or her life, saving your life, and getting you in a boat and saying, "You need to take off all your clothes until you're completely naked so I can wrap you in this blanket to warm your body temperature," you'd say, "I'm glad to do it. Can you help me?" Do you see? Context makes certain commands very accepted, given the context. This person, this individual, has just risked their life to save yours. You've never met them before, but that proof says, "I trust you. I trust you right now to do this." This is the equivalent, except, just a microcosm of what God has just done for Israel in Egypt. And his law is to be taken in that light. He's framing his law with love. These are redeeming acts of love that I've just given you. So don't receive these laws as anything but that. Because our temptation is to be suspect of law, especially in our sinful state. I want to pause a second as we begin entering into the text, and I want to read to you a story that my dad told me about and looked it up and sent me this portion of the speech. It's from South Dakota's Governor Kristi Noem, and she gave it back in February of 21 this year at CPAC, and she tells this pretty incredible story about her life and her relationship with her dad. And it's a little bit lengthy, but I'd really like you to follow. I think it gives us a very good preparation for how we should understand Israel's receiving of God's 10 words here in Exodus 20. This is the closing of her speech. She said this: "My dad was a cowboy. He was the toughest person I have ever known. Ever since I was a little girl, I wanted to be just like him. He died in a farm accident when I was 22. A couple months after he was killed, I finally got the courage to go clean out his pickup. All of you who have a farmer or a rancher in your life know that they often live out of their pickups. Everything important can be found in the cab: wallet, bills to pay, you name it. If you need to find something important, every farmer's kid knows the first place you look is in the pickup. As the new general manager of the business, every day that had passed after Dad died had been filled with 1,000 questions. What seed should we plant? What field should we plant first? What is the price we need for our calves to cash flow the cattle operation? And I didn't know the answers. I remember wishing over and over again that I could ask my dad just one more question. And frankly, I was running the business, but I was faking my way through it. I had no idea how we were going to keep our family business going without my dad, but I was determined we were not going to fail. That day, I carried a box to the pickup to clean it out. I stuck my head into the console and started putting items into the box: pliers, a Baby Ruth candy bar, notebooks, pens, tools. And then I found a tiny tape recorder, the kind a doctor dictates into. I pushed the play button and immediately heard my dad's voice. He was talking about seed corn varieties and which ones performed well on certain fields we owned. He spoke about how we had such a wet year the year before that resulted in poor crop yields and damaged grain. We had had a tough harvest, and he went on to describe what kind of variety choices we would have made differently and what he thought might work better for the spring we were anticipating. My eyes started to fill with tears as I realized I was learning information that was going to be helpful to us in making crop decisions. I looked down into the console and saw several more tapes, 12 in all. One by one, I put them in the tape recorder and listened to my dad's voice talk about cows, weather, what to do if we were ever in a tough financial situation, etc. Inside those tapes were the answers to so many of the questions I had over the past several months. Over and over again, I had said to myself, if I could just ask Dad, and here were all the answers I needed straight from him, literally in the palm of my hand. You see, friends, my purpose in reading this is because I believe it does a very good job in setting the stage for how we are to best understand these words in Exodus 20. The way Christy understood the significance of those tapes was that they were directly related to her life's vocation. And so are these laws of God directly related to our life's vocation, which is to image Him forth, to image His character, to be a reflection of who He is in His innermost heart. And these laws are essentially Him opening up His heart for us to understand what He's like, who He is, how we can look like Him. Now, here's the problem. The problem is that Christy, when she saw those tapes, her heart leapt because she was so excited to receive them. And the problem with us and with the world is that we don't quite feel as acutely the need for God's laws the way Christy did for her dad's understanding of the farm. And so what I want to do is I want to start with our brief outline this morning, 3 points. And the first point, Caleb, if you'll go to that, is their emphasis. Their emphasis. What I want you to see Here's the first point, put succinctly. You might not feel the need for the Ten Commandments as much as God wants you to feel the need for these Ten Commandments. And so what he does in the narrative is he puts all kinds of pointers linguistically and literarily to help us understand all of these fingers pointing to the significance of what's before us. So all I want to do for a moment here is just give you these pointers from the text so you can say, oh man, God really thinks this is important. He's done this so that we'd feel the importance of this. That's what I want you to catch in these short 6 little snippets that I'm going to give you here. First is that as God gives Israel these laws, he does it in such a way that they experience sensory overload. What do I mean by that? My dear friend, Pastor Brian Bill, just did a series with the church at Edgewood through the Ten Commandments, and he sent me all his messages. And one of the things that I really appreciated about his first message on the 10 words, he called it Written in Stone, that series, is he points out from Exodus 19, it's not the passage we read this morning, we read it before, but how God uses essentially the 5 senses as he delivers these words to Israel. Just listen to what happened in Exodus 19 and think of the 5 senses of the human body. Let's start with sight. We're told in Exodus 19 that lightning flashed, that there was a thick cloud of smoke, like smoke rising up from a kiln. There was the sight of fire on the mountain. Deuteronomy 5 adds that there was a thick darkness. So that is percolating the sight feature of our senses. But let's keep going. There was hearing going on. We're told there's thunder at the giving. There's a very loud trumpet blast from a ram's horn. The mountain is trembling. That would have made a rumbling noise. Then it says that God answered Moses in thunder. So when God gave these words, it was as though thunder were speaking. Let's consider that. Let's move on to touch. They weren't supposed to touch the mountain, but surely they would have felt the sound waves from the thunder being so close to them. Did they feel the heat from the fire of the mountain as fire consumed it? Did they feel the trembling of the mountain? I'll be in my office, and when tree trucks circle the parking lot, or when the garbage truck pulls in to empty the garbage, I feel that in my office. What would it feel like to be next to a mountain that was trembling? Can you imagine? So that's the sense of feeling, of touch. And then the sense of taste and smell kind of being combined here. Would they have smelled or tasted the smoke as it protruded off the mountain? We're going to Idaho. There's lots of wildfires going out west. And every time I check the weather there, it tells me the air quality. That you're going to be affected by some smoke more on certain days based on the wind than other days. What would it be like to stand next to a smoking mountain as it went up like from a kiln? What's the point in all of this? The point is that this would have been an unforgettable moment according to the senses, the 5 senses of Israel. It, in fact, was so profound that regrettably, after the 10 Commandments are given, Israel will say to Moses, hey, there's a new relationship going on here between us and God and you, and here's how we'd like to go forward. Can you ask him to never personally speak to us again? And he just talk to you, and you guys do your thing, and then you come and tell us what he says, because all that stuff, we don't want that anymore. But it was a profound experience, which tells you that these words are profound. Beyond this, and we'll move quickly through the other 5, these words are distinguished from the rest of the law in the Old Testament. The other 601 or 602, 603, there's 613. laws in the Old Testament. They're distinguished in that these are given directly to Israel by the mouth of God to them, not to Moses and then to them. Beyond this, Moses would be the official recorder of what God said, but the 10 words are actually in several places said to be written by the finger of God. These are unique. They're set aside. These tablets, some people conjecture, were 5 written on one and 5 written on the other. Very likely, according to the suzerain treaties, in which these are very similar to ancient treaties, the king was to keep one and the people were to keep one. So very possibly 5 were written on one side and 5 on the back of one, and then 5 on one side and 5 on the back of one. But what's interesting is that these are called the covenant which he commanded, and then they are to be placed in what's called the Ark of the Covenant. In other words, the Ark, which is the special manifest place of God's presence, was called the covenant because it held this covenant. So the ark itself, where God especially dwells, is known as the ark of this covenant. It's pretty incredible. Beyond this, the ark was kept in the innermost sacred portion of the tabernacle, the Holy of Holies. And beyond that, it's the only piece of furniture where we can say that human life ought to be. Before we ever talk about humanity's ought, we have to talk about humanity's is. What is humanity? And once you establish that, then let's talk about the ought of humanity, what humanity ought to be doing. Don't reverse the order. And so what this does is it takes the 10 Commandments and it helpfully puts them in context, not just of Exodus, but of Genesis and Exodus. Because what we're looking at in Exodus 20 is the ought to be. You ought to be this. But that ought to be flows out of an is, which we find back in Genesis 1, 26 to 28, which says that humanity very clearly is what? Made in the image of God, male and female, they were created. So what is humanity? Humanity is the image of God. That's what they were created to be. So once you get to the 10 Commandments, what do you find? You find God giving His image, giving His character to His image. You see, as images, we've become unfamiliar with His character. And so He takes this Exodus event and begins pouring out His character into His images. It's just like Christy being in this farm, knowing all these things need to be done, knowing, kind of having a semblance of what life should look like, but not knowing how to get there. And then she finds these tapes and it unlocks the world for her. That's what the 10 Commandments are to God's images. They give him and her the blueprint for life. That's the concept of the law. When God says in Leviticus 19, "Be holy, for I am holy," you can't disconnect that from Genesis 1, 26 and 28. Be holy, for I am holy, and I made you to be my images, so you should be holy. You should be separate and not be addicted to anything. You're separate from all things, free to take or free to leave, because I'm like that. I can participate or not and be equally happy. I'm holy. I'm separate. So be like me. You see, when we get into the law, what you'll find is God spending a lot of time talking about people's treatment of the downtrodden, of the weak, of the poor, of the disenfranchised. And so many times in those explanations of here's how you're to treat the poor and defenseless, the sojourner, the alien, the stranger, remember that I redeemed you out of Egypt. What is that? What he's saying is, I want you to treat desperate people the way I treated you because I want you to look like me. I made you to look like me. I made you, my heart breaks when I see broken people. And we as a congregation, or I won't put this sin on you, I'll just leave it to me. When I look at broken people, Ben Lovelady asked a very important question. How did they break? Did the breaking come from outside them? Or did the breaking come because of their foolish decisions? Because if the breaking came from their foolish decision, I'm less inclined to help. But if the breaking came from outside them, I'm more inclined to help. Do you see? You're getting a picture of this guy that doesn't deserve your love. But that's not what God does. God says you go to the broken people. Yeah, but God, what if they... Close your mouth, please. Close your mouth, please. Because that's not my heart. Because, by the way, First Baptist Ben Lovelady, how were you when I found you? How are you now when I continue to find you? You're a pretty broken guy. How did you get broken? A lot of willful decisions, Ben. A lot of willful decisions. And I still hang out with you all the time. This is where people like Boaz in the scriptures stand out so beautifully. You remember that Boaz lived in a time where everyone did that which was right in their own eyes. Nobody's doing the Ten Commandments. And in that time, you've got Ruth and Naomi. What are they? They're about as weak as you can get. Both of them are widows. Ruth is an alien. She's not even an Israelite. They're both poor. Ruth is essentially an orphan. I mean, Ruth fits the bill of every single thing of person you're to watch out for. And Boaz gets wind of it, and he says, listen, I want you to take special care of this girl. You watch out for her. And you don't... Remember, this is the day of Judges that Ruth took place in. You remember what happened to that guy's wife? Where he cuts her up and sends her everywhere after she was mistreated to the point of death? This is Ruth's day. She's out in the field with guys like that potentially. And Boaz says, you check this out. You protect this woman. You give her everything she needs and send extra more with her. What is Boaz? Boaz is a typification of not just the law, but God's heart. Because God's heart is the law. So what he's done with Israel is he's called them back and he says, you're mine. You're not Pharaoh's. You're mine. You're to be my images. And now I'm going to inform that character with my character, which is the law. Jerram Bars says every law we read in the Old Testament should be followed up with this question. In what way is this law calling us to be like God? In what way is this law calling us to be like God? Peter Enns puts it this way. His law tells us not simply what we must do, but what he is like. This is the concept of the law. The beginning of Exodus, he's revealed to Israel his name, but now he wants that name to become incarnated in their being. He wants them to be just like them. If you think of it in terms of science, we can all say, yeah, we've heard of the term atom, A-T-O-M. We've heard of that term, atom. But then if you've been through, I'm not sure, 6th grade, maybe science, or before or after, you start hearing of what's inside the atom, the proton, electron, neutron, nucleus. It's the inside. It's the inner being of the atom. And the law is the inner being of God. We've seen his might. We've seen his strength. We've seen him knock off all the other gods off the shelf. He alone is God. But now he says, it's time for us to sit down. I've redeemed you. Now it's time for us to have coffee. We need to talk. We need to work together. We need to hang out. You need to know me in the inside so that it can be internalized in you. What God is doing is he's redoing Eden. Exodus begins with them multiplying exponentially. He calls Israel his firstborn. He decreates the world and then recreates the world. There's new birth imagery everywhere in the text. Their calendar starts over. In multiple places, they're called a young child or an infant. Why? They are the new firstborn of creation. They're the new Adam. He's fulfilling what he always meant to fulfill, to spread his images far and wide. But just like in the garden where God gives them one no, shouldn't eat from the tree of knowledge of good and evil, so he gives them 7 no's and 3 yeses is the way they go. They meet out in the commandments. But friends, if this is all true, if we've looked at what we are to determine what we ought to be, we are the image of God, therefore we ought to behave like God, that has an unbelievably staggering implication. Are you ready for it? If you are made in God's image, therefore you are to image forth God by embodying His law. The vast implication is this: that when you live out God's law, when you live out God's character, catch this, you are experiencing humanity at its absolute richest fulfillment. You are most free. You are most satisfied. You are most nourished. You are most self-actualized when you behave, when I behave like God. That I will never be more free than I am when I am walking in God's laws. Just listen to this psalm, Psalm 119:45. It's a complete meditation, longest chapter in the Bible, complete meditation on God's law. Listen to how he talks about God's law and how counterintuitive it is from how we can think of God's law. Psalm 119:45. I shall walk in a wide place, for I have sought your precepts. You see, we're tempted to look at God's law as constricting, as binding, as like a straitjacket of joy, stifling. It's exactly how God wants you to view it. I shall walk in a wide place. What is he saying? I am, some translators say, I have great liberty because I have meditated on God's law. That you are your most free when you meditate richly and deeply on God's law. See, you go and ask anybody in the world, you ask most of us in here, when are you most free? The temptation would be when I eat as much as I want, when I look at as much as I want, when I spend as much time as I want on my own, when I talk about people. That's true freedom in the way the world defines it. The Bible looks at that and says, man, that's straight up captivity. Every one of those things. It's captivity. It's not freedom. Moitier says this: the psalmist found that the more closely he tied his life to the Word of God, the more he found he was enjoying the largest liberty. You see, friends, check this out. God liberated Israel from Egypt, and his law is meant to keep them liberated. It's a yoke. We read that, right? Daniel read that this morning. It's a yoke, but how does Jesus describe the yoke? Easy, light. You see, I've talked to drug addicts, I've talked to alcoholics that desperately need to be in rehab. And it's scary because for them, the talk of rehab sounds like what? Captivity. That's what it sounds like. But if you talk to someone that's been liberated from alcoholism, who's been liberated from drugs, they have a proper perspective on what captivity is and what freedom is. You see? The problem is that we see it so clearly in other people and their junk, but it gets real foggy when it gets to Ben Lovelady's captivities. See? They feel like freedom when they're captivity. They feel like liberty when they're confinement. Listen to how Psalm 119 talks about the law. I'm going to read you a decent portion. Just listen. He's longing to be in the image for which he was created. He's longing for that. Your testimonies are my delight. They are my counselors. My soul clings to the dust. Give me life according to your word. When I told of my ways, you answered me. Teach me your statutes. Make me understand the way of your precepts, and I will meditate on your wondrous works. My soul melts away for sorrow. Strengthen me according to your word. Put false ways far from me, and graciously teach me your law. Friend, may the Holy Spirit be illuminating to you what are your false ways this morning. The ways that you think inherently lead to life when they lead to death. I have chosen the way of faithfulness. I set your rules before me. I cling to your testimonies, O Lord. Let me not be put to shame. I will run in the way of your commandments when you enlarge my heart. Do you remember when I told you about John Edmonds' sister with the heart surgery and that her veins weren't able to deal with the healthy heart and so bled internally? Her body wasn't equipped to handle a healthy heart. He's saying, my heart can't reflect your character. It's too rich, it's too abundant, it's too generous. It's too blind to the people, or it's too unblind. It's not blind enough to the people around me. You love people regardless of their class, status, how much they can benefit me, how much they can't. You love people indiscriminately of who they are. I'm very choosy in who I love and who I hang with. Enlarge my heart to be like your heart. Teach me, O Lord, the way of your statutes, and I will keep it to the end. Give me understanding that I may keep your law and observe it with my whole heart. Lead me in the path of your commandments, for I delight in it. Incline my heart. Do you see how much he's saying? I love it, but I'm not all there yet. So incline me more. I know I like this, but so much of me doesn't yet want it fully to actually do it. So tip me over to God. Incline my heart to your testimonies and not to selfish gain. Turn my eyes from looking at worthless things and give me life in your ways. Confirm to your servant your promise that you may be feared. Turn away the reproach that I dread, for your rules are good. Behold, I long for your precepts. In your righteousness, give me life. Friends, in order for us to want God's laws like we should, we have to follow his cues, and his cues are meditate on what I did for you in Egypt. Meditate on what I did for you at the cross. Meditate on my saving act, just like with that deep sea diver rescuing you out of hypothermic waters. You meditate on his act of love, which enables you to do something that seems in the moment maybe counterintuitive. So God says to us, my liberation in Egypt, my salvation in Christ are meant to quell any competing allegiances, any inferior refuges that you might pursue. There's no love like mine. There's no refuge like mine. There's no joy in anything's presence as much as there's joy in mine. It's here where you're meant to thrive. If you don't trust me, look at the cross. Look at the blood over the door. Look at the way I pour my life out for you to have life, and trust that in my laws you'll find a very pleasant boundary placed. Turning to any other refuge is not gain but loss. It's not freedom, it's captivity. Know that. He's giving Israel a key to the greatest ecstasy they could ever experience on earth. Isn't it sad? When I was writing out the word ecstasy, I felt like, man, maybe that's too much of an R-rated word. Isn't it sad that our culture has taken a word like ecstasy and stolen it from the proper hands? That the true, when you think of what's the highest joy, you think of a word like ecstasy. But now we've got a drug called ecstasy. Now it is attached with adult material and sorts of things like that. Satan steals the greatest joy, and we as Christians can think, well, then we're in some sort of inferior setting when they've stolen that word. Listen to what Jesus says. The thief comes to steal, kill, and destroy, but I have come to give life and give it abundantly. Truly, truly, I say to you, everyone who practices sin is a slave to sin. The slave does not remain in the house forever. The Son remains forever. So if the Son sets you free, you will be free indeed. James calls the law a law of liberty. Friends, my challenge this morning is that you test him on that. You test him. And you say, God, your law feels like a straitjacket sometimes. Feels like a murderer at other times. I feel like Israel at the mountain, that if I hear you speak one more time, I will be simply obliterated, because your law will cut me so deeply and will annihilate me so quickly, because I've fallen not just once, but numerous times, not just over the period of my life, but in the course of a few minutes, a day. I'm guilty as charged. And God says, I got awesome news for you. The Septuagint, the Greek translation of the Old Testament, refers to the law as the Decalogue. 10 logos, word. The 10 words. Old Testament calls it the 10 words in Hebrew. And we get to the New Testament, and we're introduced to someone whose title is, in the beginning was the Word. The Word was with God. The Word was God. And that Word moved into our neighborhoods. Jesus has become the law fulfiller in place of all of us law failers. And He gives us His words, He gives us His law to say, I want you to be like that everywhere, for everyone you encounter. Outside the church, inside the church, outside your family, inside your family. I want you to be me wherever you go. And I'm gentle and lowly. I'm easy to talk to. I'm accommodating with truth and love. But I'm open to everything and everyone. And my job is to conform the entirety of the globe to my image. And you can't do that on your strength, but my Spirit will assist you every step of the way, and you will be a kingdom of priests and a holy nation. And the people will look at you and they will want to know, how is it you have that joy? Welcome to the 10 Commandments. I'll ask the musicians to come.